All right. Ready to dive into something pretty interesting.
Oh, yeah, always.
We're going to be looking at race
Okay.
from a Christian perspective this time.
Interesting.
So this should be pretty thought-provoking.
Absolutely.
We're using this article. It's called A Christian Understanding on Race.
Mm,
And I have a feeling this is going to be a deep dive
yeah,
that we won't forget anytime soon. Now, obviously, this
Sure.
can be a really sensitive topic.
of course.
So just remember that we're just trying to understand the author's viewpoint.
For sure.
We're not necessarily endorsing or debating it.
Gotcha.
So think of us like your companions on this journey
Right.
through some pretty thought-provoking ideas. What do you think?
I like that. That's a good way to frame it. I'm excited to see what this author, what kind of arguments they're making.
Me too. And it's interesting because they bring in a lot of different things, not just theology,
Right.
but also science and history. It's
Interesting.
all mixed together.
A little bit of everything in the pot.
Yeah. Like, how does our faith intertwine with how we understand
Okay.
human origins, genetics, that kind of thing?
Right.
And what does that mean for
Right.
how we should live today?
Right. Right.
Big questions.
Big questions.
So keep those in mind as we start going through this.
Absolutely.
Now, one of the first things the author says
Okay.
is that race is a biological fact,
Okay.
not just a social construct.
Interesting.
What do you think about that? That's a pretty bold statement.
That is a bold statement. I think they're trying to say that race is real, like in a biological sense. And we can't ignore that, like it or not,
Right. So they're kind of pushing back against that idea,
Exactly.
that race is just a social idea with no grounding
In our physical body.
Right. Like it doesn't actually exist.
Yeah.
It's just something we made up.
Right.
But they're saying, no, it's real in a biological sense.
And it's important to acknowledge that.
And they actually bring in some science to back this up.
Oh,
They talk about, anthropologists being able to look at super old skeletons
Mhm.
and determine
Wow.
someone's race,
Interesting.
like thousands of years old,
Yeah.
and they can still tell.
So what are they looking at to determine that?
Well, things like their skeletal structure
Right.
and their skin color. You can sometimes figure that out from the bones
Oh, interesting.
and facial features.
Okay.
All those things can show traces of your ancestry.
Fascinating.
And those observable traits that they're talking about,
Mhm.
that's called your phenotype,
Very
which
good.
is a mix of your genes and environment.
Right. Makes sense.
Yeah.
So are they saying that those physical differences are what make race real?
Yeah, it seems like they're using those physical differences as evidence that race is more than just a social construct.
Okay, I see. It's like they're laying the groundwork for their argument.
Exactly. And the way they blend science with religion is fascinating.
It is. It's not your typical approach, is it?
No, not at all. It's like they're speaking two different languages at the same time.
Right. You've got the scientific language with genes and mutations and even selective breeding.
Yeah.
And then you've got the theological arguments about God's plan and purpose.
Exactly. Like, they even use evolution to argue that race was intentionally created.
Now, that's interesting. How do they square that with the idea that evolution is random, driven by chance?
That's what I was wondering, too.
Yeah.
But they use this concept of genetic information loss.
Okay.
So imagine, like, animals adapting to cold climates.
Sure.
Some have thin coats, some have thick coats.
Right.
The ones with thin coats, they're not going to survive in a freezing environment, right?
Makes sense.
So only the thick-coated ones pass on their genes.
So over time, the gene for a thin coat just disappears.
Exactly. So the author's point is that evolution isn't creating new information.
Okay.
It's more like it's narrowing down the existing options.
I see. So they're saying that God created all the different variations in the beginning,
Mhm.
and then evolution just kind of sorted them out.
Right. It's like survival of the fittest, but with a divine twist.
A divine twist, yeah.
Yeah.
That's a new way of looking at it.
And they extend this logic to say that God created the different races deliberately. It wasn't just random mutations happening over time.
Good.
Each race, they say, represents a specific and intentional expression of God's design.
So every race has a purpose, according to this view.
Exactly. And to back this up, they bring in the Tower of Babel story from the Bible.
The Tower of Babel. Now, why does that come into play?
That's a good question. The Tower of Babel is about humanity being united with one language and one purpose.
Right.
They're trying to build a tower to reach heaven.
Okay.
But God sees this as pride and defiance.
Mm-hmm.
So he scatters humanity across the earth and creates different languages, leading to all the different cultures we see today.
Okay, so the Tower of Babel explains the origin of different languages and cultures.
Right.
But how does the author connect that to the origin of different races?
Well, they see that scattering of humanity as the moment when different races started to form.
Okay.
Imagine groups of people migrating to different parts of the world, deserts, mountains, icy regions.
Right.
They'd have to adapt to survive those environments, right?
Absolutely. Different environments, different challenges.
And those adaptations over time led to the physical differences we associate with race.
So they're saying it wasn't just random chance. It was a deliberate act by God to create this racial diversity.
Exactly. The scattering of people, their adaptations, it's all presented as part of a larger divine plan.
Wow, that's a bold interpretation. And are they saying there's a specific purpose to this diversity?
Yes. They argue that this diversity isn't just an outcome, it serves a purpose. They actually give two main purposes.
Oh, okay. I'm intrigued. Tell me more.
The first one is about survival. They say that different races with their unique adaptations are better suited to handle certain diseases, climates, environments.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. Like, if one group struggles in a certain environment, another might thrive.
Exactly. It's like a backup system for humanity, ensuring we can survive in all sorts of conditions.
Like diversifying your investments, but for the survival of the human race.
Exactly. And the second purpose gets a little more philosophical.
Okay, I'm listening.
They suggest that racial diversity is also a way for God to safeguard the truth of Christianity.
Okay, now that's a fascinating idea. How do they connect race to preserving religious truth?
Well, they say that different races, each with their own unique culture and ways of expressing faith,
Okay.
act as safeguards against Christianity's teachings getting corrupted or lost.
So it's like having multiple backups of a really important file.
Exactly. Just in case one gets corrupted, you've got multiple copies, multiple versions.
So even different denominations within Christianity, Catholic, Protestant, Orthodox, they're all part of this safeguard.
Exactly. They're all contributing to preserving those core beliefs in their own way.
It's like God created a multifaceted system to ensure the longevity and accurate transmission of Christian teachings.
That's quite a system. But then the article zooms in on a specific group, the Hebrews.
The Hebrews. Okay, what's so special about them in this context?
Well, this is where it gets a little sensitive. They discuss this idea of God favoring certain groups, and they specifically highlight the Hebrews as the chosen people.
Okay, so that ties into traditional Christian theology, the idea of the covenant with Abraham and the Israelites.
Exactly. And they connect this favoritism to the idea that the Hebrews played a unique role in preserving God's word before it was written down.
Oh, interesting. So they were like the living embodiment of the scriptures before they were actually written down.
That's the idea. And they even mention Jewish intelligence, connecting it to this ability to preserve religious knowledge. But is that a widely held belief within Christianity, or is it a more unique or maybe even controversial interpretation?
Yeah, that's a key question. I mean, the idea of God choosing the Hebrews is central to Christianity, but this specific link to intelligence and their role in preserving God's word is not something you'd find in every church.
So it's less about established doctrine and more about personal interpretation.
Exactly. It's one particular lens through which to view this concept. And, when you're talking about claims like this, especially those related to intelligence and specific racial or ethnic groups, it's super important to be sensitive and mindful of the historical baggage that comes with those kinds of statements. We're just exploring the author's viewpoint here, not endorsing or refuting it.
Right. It's all about understanding the perspective.
Exactly. And it's important to remember that there are many other perspectives out there.
Absolutely. Okay, so we've covered this idea of race being both biological and divinely ordained, the purpose of diversity, and this unique role of the Hebrews.
Right.
But the article doesn't stop there. It goes on to discuss nations, and this is where things get even more interesting and maybe a little uncomfortable.
Okay, now I'm really curious. Nations and race, how does that tie in?
Well, you'll have to wait for part 2 to find out.
You've got me hooked. I can't wait to see where this goes.
So we left off with this idea about God maybe showing a preference to certain nations, which is a pretty bold statement, wouldn't you say?
It is. It is. That raises some big questions.
It does. So the article states that God favors nations that are ethno-homogeneous.
Ethno-homogeneous.
Yeah. So that means having a single dominant ethnic group.
Okay. So essentially, God prefers nations that are not very diverse.
Yeah. Not very racially or ethnically diverse.
Okay. But doesn't that kind of go against like the whole message of Christianity.
Yeah, it's definitely tricky to balance.
Yeah.
Because on the one hand, you have this idea of God loving everyone.
Right.
But then on the other hand, maybe he prefers certain groups of people.
Right. So what does the author say about that?
Well, they argue that diversity is okay, but only to a certain point. So they believe that as long as a supermajority of a nation
Okay.
remains the same ethnically, then some internal diversity can be tolerated.
Okay, so like a little bit of diversity is fine,
Yeah.
but too much starts to become a problem.
That seems to be their take on it.
It's like there's a limit, a threshold.
Yeah, like a sliding scale of diversity.
Right.
And this connects to modern debates about multiculturalism.
Oh, yeah, for sure. That's a hot topic.
Big time. And the author seems to be pretty wary of it.
Really? So they don't see multiculturalism as a good thing.
They think it can actually weaken a nation's sense of unity.
Like it dilutes the shared identity.
Yeah, and they specifically connect this to the decline of Western civilization.
Oh, wow. So they're saying that embracing multiculturalism is leading to the downfall of the West.
That's their argument, and it seems to stem from this belief that Western civilization is intrinsically linked to Christianity.
So to preserve the West, you have to preserve Christianity.
Exactly. And multiculturalism, in their view, threatens both.
That's a pretty strong stance.
Yeah.
And it definitely raises some questions, like how do we balance these different values?
Yeah.
Like the value of preserving a certain culture versus embracing the richness of different cultures.
Right. Those are the tough questions we have to grapple with as a society.
It's like, how much weight do we give to each side of that equation?
Exactly. And it seems like the author is firmly on the side of preservation.
Right. They see the decline
Yeah.
as a direct result of moving away from these traditional values.
Right. They see it as a consequence of embracing multiculturalism, secularism,
Right.
all those modern trends.
Yes. And they're saying it's leading us away from God's favor.
That's their warning. It's almost like they see history
Yeah.
as this ongoing battle
A battle.
between good and evil.
Right.
And the fate of nations depends on which side wins.
So they see this as a spiritual war,
Yeah.
essentially.
Yeah, and it's not just about social or political changes. They see it as a spiritual battle with secularism and multiculturalism as the opposing forces.
Wow. That's a powerful way to frame it.
Yeah.
So it's not just about policies or demographics.
Yeah,
It's about something much deeper, a clash of worldviews.
Exactly. And this is where I find the author's perspective so fascinating
Yeah.
because they're weaving together all these different ideas.
It's a complex,
Yeah.
a complex argument.
Genetics, theology, history,
Yeah.
even current political debates.
Right.
To create this whole worldview
Wow.
that's really shaped by their understanding of race.
It really shows how much our understanding of race is tied to our beliefs
Yeah.
about the world, about our place in it.
Absolutely. It's not just about biology or social constructs. It
Right.
goes much deeper than
It's
that.
connected to history, culture, religious beliefs,
Yeah.
all of that.
And this article gives us a glimpse into one particular way of seeing all of that.
One specific lens through which to view these complex issues.
And that's what I love about these deep dives. We get to explore these different ways of thinking,
Right.
even if we don't agree with everything we hear.
Absolutely. It's about broadening our understanding and really grappling with the complexity of these issues.
All right, so we've covered this idea of race being both biological
Right.
and divinely ordained. The purpose of diversity, the idea of favored nations, and this whole concept of the decline of Western civilization.
A lot to unpack there.
It's been a whirlwind tour, and I think it's safe to say that
Yeah.
this author has a very specific and maybe even controversial point of view.
They do.
Yeah.
And it's super important to remember that this is just one perspective.
Yes, absolutely. There are countless other ways
Right.
to understand race, both within and outside of religious frameworks.
Totally. And we always encourage our listeners
Yeah.
to explore different viewpoints
Mhm.
and come to their own conclusions.
Absolutely. But before we wrap things up for this part, there's one final point from the article I want to touch on.
All right. Why is it?
Amidst all this talk of decline and God's shifting favor,
Right.
the author actually ends on a note of hope.
Oh, that's interesting. What do they say?
So we've really dug deep into this article's perspective on race, the biological basis, the spiritual purpose, and even the anxieties about societal change. What stood out to you the most?
I think what struck me was just how ambitious the author's argument is.
Oh, yeah.
It's like they're trying to weave together, all these different things, scientific concepts, theological interpretations,
Right.
observations about modern society into like this I don't know, unified theory of race.
Right, right. It's a lot to take
It's
in.
quite a tapestry,
Hmm.
even if some of the threads might feel a bit tangled, you know?
Yeah, it's like they're looking at human history through this very specific lens, one that sees God's hand in everything.
Yeah, I get.
From our physical features to, like, the rise and fall of civilizations.
Right. And that lens really colors their perspective on the role of race and diversity.
It does. They're very clear that those racial differences are divinely ordained, part of a larger purposeful plan.
Right.
But then the question is, how does that idea fit with, the realities of human history?
Exactly, because throughout history, these divinely ordained differences have been used to justify some pretty terrible things.
Right, like inequality, discrimination, oppression,
Yeah.
all of that. So how do we reconcile that with this idea of a loving God,
Okay.
a just God?
That's the question, isn't it?
It's a big one.
And the article seems to, I don't know, kind of avoid it.
Really?
They focus more on preserving cultural and religious identity
Right.
than on, the ethical implications. It's like they're saying, here's the divine blueprint, but they don't give us much guidance on how to build a just and equitable society within that framework.
Right, like good luck figuring that out.
Yeah, it's kind of like that.
So it seems like we're left with more questions than answers.
I think so. But maybe that's okay.
Yeah.
Maybe the point of this deep dive isn't to find all the answers,
Mm-hmm.
but to kind of encourage us to wrestle with these tough issues.
Yeah.
Think critically about our own assumptions.
Absolutely. And this article certainly challenges us to do that.
It does. And I think it's important to remember that this is just one perspective on a very complex topic.
For sure.
There are so many other ways of understanding race,
Right.
both within and outside of religious frameworks.
Absolutely. So keep exploring, keep questioning.
Exactly. Engage with different voices. Come to your own conclusions.
So to wrap things up, I think the takeaway here is that our understanding of race is often shaped by a whole bunch of factors.
Yeah.
Beliefs, experiences, interpretation.
All connected.
Yeah, and this article just gives us one particular lens
Right.
through which to view this complex issue.
Yeah.
So as we end this deep dive, we want to leave you with a final thought.
Okay. What is it?
If race is part of a divine plan, as the author suggests, what responsibility do we have to make sure that plan unfolds in a way that honors the dignity and equality of all people?
That's a profound question.
Yeah,
It really gets to the heart of how we live out our beliefs.
it does. And I think it's a question that we all need to grapple with, regardless of our background or beliefs.
Yeah.
So keep exploring, keep learning, and keep the conversation going.
Absolutely. The conversation doesn't end here. It's a journey.
It is, and we're all in this together. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.